I signed the papers with a steady hand, and my son smiled like he had just won something. But he had no idea that moment would become the biggest mistake of his life. I remember the exact weight of the pen in my fingers, the soft scratch of ink against paper, and the way Rachel stood just behind Michael, her hand resting lightly on his shoulder as if she were the quiet support in the room, when in truth, she was guiding everything without saying a word. They told me it was just a precaution, something responsible, something loving. In case anything ever happens, Michael had said, his voice calm, practiced, almost too smooth. I had raised him better than that, or at least I thought I had. At 72, after losing my husband just 18 months earlier, I had learned how silence could stretch across a house like a second skin. Mornings were the hardest. I would wake up expecting to hear Harold in the kitchen, the clink of his coffee mug, the low hum of the morning news. Instead, there was only stillness. That kind of stillness makes you reach for something solid, something familiar. For me, that something became my son. Michael started visiting more often after the funeral. At first, I thought it was grief bringing him closer, a delayed reaction to losing his father. He brought groceries, fixed a loose cabinet door, even sat with me on the porch some evenings without checking his phone. It felt like getting a piece of my life back. But Rachel was always there, just slightly behind him, watching more than speaking, smiling at the right moments, asking questions that sounded caring but lingered a little too long. "Are you keeping up with the bills okay?" she asked once, her tone light, almost casual. Managing all the paperwork must be overwhelming. I told her I was fine. I had always been fine. For 45 years, I had managed a household, balanced accounts, paid off a mortgage, and raised a family. But she nodded in that slow, understanding way that didn't quite match her eyes. The idea of giving Michael power of attorney didn't come all at once. It was introduced gently, piece by piece, like a suggestion that grew roots before I even realized it had been planted. First it was convenience, just in case you're ever in the hospital. Then it became reassurance. It would give me peace of mind, Mom. And finally, it turned into something that felt almost inevitable. Everyone does this at some point. The day we went to sign the documents, Rachel had already chosen the attorney. That should have been my first warning. But I told myself it was thoughtful, efficient. The office smelled faintly of leather and polished wood, the kind of place designed to make everything feel official, permanent. The attorney spoke quickly, confidently, flipping through pages with practiced ease. I listened, but not closely enough. I trusted my son. That was my second mistake. When it was done, Michael squeezed my hand and said, "You won't regret this." And I smiled, because at that moment, I believed him. For a while, nothing changed. Or at least, nothing obvious. My routine stayed the same. I paid my bills, went to the grocery store, called my sister on Sundays. But then, small things began to shift. My bank sent a notification about a change I didn't remember making. A payment was scheduled differently. A statement looked off. When I called to ask, the woman on the phone hesitated before explaining that an authorized agent had adjusted a few settings on my account. "Your son," she added, as if that explained everything. I hung up slowly, staring at the kitchen table where I had signed those papers just weeks earlier. The sunlight came through the window in thin, pale lines, illuminating dust that seemed to hang in the air longer than it should. I told myself it was nothing, just a misunderstanding. But that night, as I lay in bed, I realized something I hadn't allowed myself to think before. Control doesn't disappear all at once. It slips away quietly, one decision at a time, until you wake up and realize someone else is holding it. And the most dangerous part isn't losing it. It's realizing too late that you handed it over willingly. I did not confront him the next day, or the day after that, because I needed to understand how far this had already gone before I said a single word. The house felt different in a way I could not quite explain, not because anything had physically changed, but because something invisible had shifted beneath the surface, like a floorboard that looked solid until you stepped on it and felt it give. I started paying closer attention to the small things, the details most people would overlook, because I had learned over the years that the truth rarely announces itself loudly. It hides in patterns, in habits, in the quiet spaces between what is said and what is done. Michael called more frequently now, always checking in, always asking questions that sounded concerned but felt rehearsed. "Did you get your statement this month, Mom?" he asked one afternoon, his tone casual but precise. Everything looked normal? I told him yes, even though I had not yet decided what normal meant anymore. I could hear Rachel's voice faintly in the background, not speaking directly to me, but close enough to know she was listening. That was when I realized something important. They were not just involved. They were coordinated. I began to go through my paperwork carefully, sitting at the same kitchen table where I had once balanced checkbooks with ease. The numbers still made sense to me, but the decisions behind them did not. There were transfers I did not remember authorizing, small at first, almost insignificant, the kind of amounts that would not raise alarms if you were not looking for them. But I was looking now. And once you start looking, you cannot stop seeing. A utility payment redirected. A subscription canceled and replaced with something else. A change in mailing preferences that I had never requested. Each one by itself could be explained away. Together, they formed a pattern that felt deliberate. I called the bank again, this time asking more specific questions. The representative hesitated longer before answering. And when she finally spoke, her voice carried that careful tone people use when they are not sure how much they are allowed to say. Your authorized agent has full access under the current documentation, she explained. Any adjustments made would be considered valid. Valid. It was a simple word, but it carried a weight that settled heavily in my chest. I thanked her and hung up, then sat there for a long time without moving. The clock on the wall ticked steadily, marking time in a way that suddenly felt much more important than it had the day before. I thought about Harold then, about the way he used to double-check everything, even things that seemed unnecessary. Trust is good, he would say, but clarity is better. I had trusted, without demanding clarity, and now I was beginning to understand the cost of that choice. That evening, Michael stopped by unannounced. He let himself in with the spare key I had given him years ago, calling out my name as if nothing had changed. He brought dinner, something from a restaurant I used to like, and set it out on the table with an easy familiarity that might have comforted me under different circumstances. Rachel followed a few minutes later, carrying a bottle of wine and that same composed smile she always wore. They moved through my home like they belonged there, like they had always belonged there, and for the first time, I saw it clearly. This was not concern. This was control. We sat down to eat, and Michael talked about work, about plans, about things that had nothing to do with me. Yet somehow everything circled back to my situation. You should not have to worry about all this anymore, he said, gesturing lightly as if he were offering me a gift. That is why I am here. I nodded, keeping my expression calm, my voice steady, because reacting too soon would only give them what they wanted. Rachel watched me closely, her eyes sharp despite her gentle tone. We just want what is best for you, she added, and there it was again. That careful phrasing that sounded kind but felt like a decision already made. I realized then that they believed I had already given up more than just paperwork. They thought I had given up awareness, that I had stepped aside completely. And that was their third mistake. Because while they were busy assuming I would not notice, I had already begun to see everything. And once you see the pattern, once you understand the intent behind it, you do not react with anger. You respond with patience. I finished my dinner slowly, listening more than speaking, letting them fill the silence with their own confidence. Because the more confident they became, the more they revealed. And I was no longer the woman who signed those papers without question. I was the woman who had finally started asking the right ones. I did not sleep much that night, not because I was afraid, but because my mind had finally started connecting pieces that I had ignored for too long. And once those pieces begin to align, rest becomes impossible. By morning, I knew I needed something more than suspicion. I needed confirmation, something undeniable, something that would tell me exactly how far they had already gone. So I did something I had not done in years. I called someone I trusted outside of my family. His name was Thomas Green, the attorney who had handled my husband's estate, a man who had known Harold for over 20 years and who understood the way we managed our affairs. When I told him I wanted to review some documents, he did not ask many questions. He simply said, "Come in this afternoon," in a tone that told me he already suspected more than I had said. His office was smaller than the one Michael and Rachel had taken me to, less polished, less theatrical, but it felt grounded in a way that immediately steadied me. Thomas greeted me with a firm handshake and a quiet look that lingered just long enough to let me know he was paying attention. I handed him copies of my recent statements, the documents I had been able to gather, and most importantly, the power of attorney paperwork I had signed. He read everything carefully, without rushing, without interrupting, and the silence in that room felt very different from the silence in my home. This silence held weight, purpose, clarity. After several minutes, he leaned back slightly in his chair and removed his glasses, which was something I remembered he used to do whenever he was about to say something important. "Eleanor," he said gently, "did anyone explain to you the full scope of what you signed?" I answered honestly. "They said it was just in case I needed help." He nodded once, slowly, as if confirming something he had already begun to suspect. "This document gives your son complete authority over your financial decisions," he continued. "Not partial, not limited, complete." The word complete settled into the room like something heavy and immovable. I felt it, not as a shock, but as a quiet confirmation of what I had already begun to understand. Thomas continued reviewing the statements, pointing out details I had noticed but had not fully interpreted. "These transfers," he said, tapping lightly on the page, "they are structured, small enough to avoid immediate concern, but consistent enough to indicate planning." Planning. That word mattered. It meant this was not a mistake. It was a process. I asked him the question that had been forming in my mind since the night before. "Can this be undone?" He did not answer immediately, which told me the truth before he even spoke. "Yes," he said finally, "but not without evidence and not without careful timing." Timing. That was when everything shifted inside me. Because until that moment, I had been thinking about what they had done. Now, I began thinking about what I would do next. Thomas explained what I needed to look for, what would constitute clear misuse, what steps could be taken to protect myself without alerting them too early. "If they believe you are unaware," he said, "they will continue. And that is when they will make mistakes." I understood exactly what he meant. People who think they are in control become careless. They stop hiding. They start assuming. And assumptions are where the truth reveals itself. When I left his office, I did not feel overwhelmed. I felt focused. The air outside was cool, the kind of crisp afternoon that sharpens your thoughts instead of dulling them. I sat in my car for a moment, looking at my hands resting on the steering wheel, steady, capable, not the hands of someone who had lost control, but the hands of someone who had just taken the first step toward reclaiming it. That evening, when Michael called, I answered on the second ring, my voice calm, even warm. "I was thinking," I said, as if the thought had just occurred to me. "Maybe you could help me review a few more things this week. It would give me peace of mind." There was a brief pause on the other end, just long enough for me to hear the shift in his breathing, the subtle rise of confidence returning. "Of course, Mom," he said quickly. "That is what I am here for." And I smiled, not because I trusted him, but because I finally understood him. Because while they believed they had already secured everything they wanted, they had overlooked one thing they should have never underestimated. They had assumed I would stop paying attention, and that assumption was going to cost them everything. I began preparing the house the next morning, not in any obvious way, but in the quiet, methodical manner I had learned over decades of managing a life that no one else ever truly saw in full. I placed documents back where they belonged, left certain statements slightly visible on the kitchen counter, and made sure the checkbook sat open to a page that looked recently used, even though I had not written a check in weeks. It was not deception. It was positioning. By the time Michael arrived that afternoon, everything looked exactly the way he expected it to look, and that was precisely the point. He walked in with the same easy confidence he had carried the night before, his jacket draped over his arm, his expression relaxed in a way that told me he believed he was still ahead of everything. Rachel followed shortly after, her presence as composed as ever, her eyes moving briefly across the room in a quick, practiced scan before settling on me with a gentle smile. "You said you wanted help going over a few things," Michael said, already moving toward the table without waiting for my response, as if the invitation itself had granted him ownership of the space. I nodded and gestured toward the papers, keeping my tone light, almost grateful. "I just want to make sure I am doing everything right," I said, letting a trace of uncertainty enter my voice, just enough to reinforce the version of me they had already decided to believe in. Rachel took a seat beside him, close enough to see everything, far enough to maintain the illusion that she was only there for support. That was her role, I realized. Not the one in charge, but the one who made sure everything stayed aligned. As Michael began flipping through the documents, I watched carefully, not the papers, but his reactions. The way his fingers paused for half a second longer on certain pages. The way he adjusted his posture when he reached a section that mattered more than the others. "You do not need to worry about most of this anymore," he said, his voice calm, almost reassuring. But there was a firmness underneath it now, something that had not been there before. "That is what I am handling." Handling. It was a word that sounded helpful on the surface, but beneath it was something else entirely. Control, redefined as care. I asked a few questions, simple ones, the kind that would not raise suspicion. "What about this?" "Transfer," I said, pointing lightly to a line item I had already discussed with Thomas. Michael glanced at it quickly, then smiled. "Just routine adjustments," he replied, too quickly, too smoothly. Rachel nodded beside him, reinforcing the answer without adding anything of her own. That was when I saw it clearly. They had practiced this. Not necessarily the exact questions, but the structure of their responses, the way they would redirect, reassure, and move on before anything could be examined too closely. I leaned back slightly in my chair, letting a moment of silence stretch just long enough to make them fill it. "I am glad you are helping me with this," I said softly, and I meant it, though not in the way they thought. Because every word they spoke, every explanation they offered, was giving me exactly what I needed. Not answers, but patterns. Rachel reached for one of the statements, her fingers brushing the edge of the page as if she were simply organizing it. But her eyes lingered on a section I recognized immediately. It was one of the accounts Thomas had flagged. She did not say anything, but the slight tightening of her expression was enough. That account mattered to her, more than the others. I filed that away without reacting. "Maybe next time we should look at everything together," Michael suggested, closing the folder with a sense of finality that felt premature. "So we can make sure everything stays on track." On track. The phrase echoed in my mind long after he said it. Because what he meant was not my track. It was theirs. I nodded again, smiling in the same quiet, agreeable way I had used for most of my life, the way that had once kept peace in my home, and now served a very different purpose. When they finally left, the house returned to its usual stillness, but it no longer felt empty. It felt clear. I gathered the papers slowly, placing them back in their folders with careful precision, my movements steady, deliberate. Then I picked up the phone and called Thomas. "I think I know which account matters most to them," I said, my voice calm, certain. There was a brief pause on the other end, followed by a quiet acknowledgement. "Good," he replied. "That is where we start." I hung up and looked around the room, at the table, the chairs, the small details that had once defined my life in ways I had taken for granted. Nothing had changed, and yet everything had. Because now, I was no longer reacting to what had been done. I was preparing for what would come next. And for the first time since I signed those papers, I was not one step behind them. I was exactly where I needed to be. I did not rush the next step because rushing would have meant reacting, and reacting was exactly what they expected from me. But what they did not expect was patience shaped by clarity. The following morning, I drove back to the bank, not to ask questions this time, but to observe, to confirm what Thomas and I had already begun to suspect. The building looked the same as it always had, quiet, orderly, predictable, but I walked in with a different understanding of what could happen inside a place like that when the wrong person held the right authority. I requested a full transaction history for the account Rachel had lingered on, keeping my voice steady, my expression neutral. The young man behind the counter did not hesitate, simply printed the documents and handed them to me with a polite smile, unaware that he was placing evidence into my hands. I sat down in one of the small chairs near the window and began reading carefully, line by line, not skimming, not assuming, but truly reading. And that was when the pattern stopped being subtle. The amounts were no longer small enough to dismiss as routine. They had grown, slowly at first, then with increasing confidence, as if whoever was behind them had tested the boundaries and found no resistance. Transfers to accounts I did not recognize. Payments labeled vaguely enough to avoid attention, yet consistent enough to reveal intent. Dates that aligned too closely with the visits Michael and Rachel had made to my house. It was not random. It was structured. And most importantly, it was ongoing. I felt no surge of panic, no rush of anger, only a quiet, steady awareness settling into place. This was no longer a suspicion. It was confirmation. I folded the papers neatly and placed them back into my bag, then stepped outside into the afternoon light, which felt sharper now, more defined, as if the world itself had come into focus along with everything else. When I returned home, I did not call Thomas immediately. Instead, I sat at the kitchen table and allowed myself a moment to reflect, not on what had been taken, but on how it had been done. Because understanding the method was just as important as proving the action. They had not acted recklessly. They had been careful, incremental, deliberate, which meant they believed they were safe. That belief would be their weakness. Later that evening, Michael called again, his tone relaxed, confident, the same tone he had used when this all began. "Just checking in," he said, as if nothing had changed. I responded in kind, my voice warm, appreciative, giving him no reason to question anything. "I went to the bank today," I mentioned casually, as though it were an afterthought. There was a brief pause, barely noticeable, but I heard it, the smallest disruption in his rhythm. "Oh," he said, quickly recovering. "Everything look okay?" I smiled to myself, even though he could not see it. "It was a lot to go through," I replied, allowing just enough uncertainty into my tone to reassure him. "I might need your help understanding some of it." That was all it took. His confidence returned immediately, stronger than before. "Of course," he said, almost too quickly. "We can sit down again tomorrow." Tomorrow. He was eager now. And eagerness, I had learned, often leads to carelessness. After the call ended, I picked up the documents once more, running my fingers lightly across the pages, not out of sentiment, but out of recognition. Each line represented a decision they thought I would never question. Each number reflected a step they believed I would never retrace. But they had made one critical miscalculation. They had assumed that time worked only in their favor, that if they moved slowly enough, quietly enough, I would never notice the accumulation. What they did not understand was that time works differently for someone who has lived long enough to recognize patterns. I gathered everything together and placed it neatly in a folder, then set it aside with the same calm precision I had used when I first began managing my household decades ago. There was no rush now, no urgency, because I already had what I needed. Not just proof, but direction. The next move would not be about discovering what they had done. It would be about allowing them to continue just long enough to reveal everything they thought they had hidden. And this time, I would not interrupt them. I would let them show me exactly who they were. The next day, I made sure everything appeared exactly as it had the day before, because consistency builds trust, and trust was the last thing they deserved, but the one thing I needed them to believe I still had. When Michael arrived, he carried himself with a confidence that had grown noticeably stronger, as if my uncertainty the night before had reassured him that nothing had changed. Rachel followed closely behind, her presence quiet but deliberate, her eyes once again scanning the room before settling into that same composed expression she wore so well. I welcomed them in without hesitation, gesturing toward the kitchen table where the documents were already laid out, arranged in a way that suggested I had tried to make sense of them on my own and failed. "I looked at everything again," I said, letting my voice carry just enough doubt to guide them where I wanted them to go, "but some of it still does not make sense to me." Michael smiled, stepping forward with an ease that felt almost rehearsed now, and took his seat as though he were resuming a role he had already mastered. "That is why I am here," he said, echoing the same words he had used before, but this time there was less warmth in them and more certainty. He began reviewing the papers, moving more quickly than he had the previous day, his attention narrowing on the sections that mattered most, no longer pretending to examine everything equally. Rachel leaned in slightly, her hand resting near the edge of the table, close enough to follow every detail, and when their eyes met briefly over a specific page, I saw it clearly. A silent agreement, a shared understanding that did not need to be spoken aloud. I asked another question, this time about a larger transfer, one that Thomas had identified as a critical point. "This one seems different," I said, keeping my tone soft, almost hesitant. Michael barely glanced at it before responding. "That was an adjustment we had to make for long-term planning," he said, his voice smooth, confident, but lacking the careful pacing he had used before. Rachel nodded again, but this time her expression tightened just slightly, as if she were aware that something about that answer did not fully hold. It was a small crack, almost invisible, but once you see a crack, you know where to apply pressure. I let the moment pass without challenge, allowing them to believe their explanation had been accepted. Then I did something simple. I asked for help with something unrelated. Would you mind checking the authorization details again? I said, sliding another document toward him, one that I knew would require him to engage more directly with the authority he believed he held. He did not hesitate. That was the mistake. He began explaining the scope of his access, describing what he could do, what he had already adjusted, and what he planned to manage moving forward. Each word came more easily than the last, each explanation more revealing than the one before it. He was no longer just responding. He was demonstrating. And Rachel, sitting beside him, did not interrupt. She allowed it to happen, which told me she believed the situation was still fully under their control. I listened carefully, not reacting, not interrupting, just absorbing every detail, every confirmation, every assumption they made about what I did or did not understand. When he finished, I nodded slowly, as though I were finally beginning to grasp the complexity of it all. I am glad you are taking care of this, I said quietly, and I meant it in a way they could not possibly interpret. Because the more he took care of, the more he exposed. The visit ended sooner than the last one, not because they were cautious, but because they were comfortable. They believed the situation was stable, predictable, resolved. When they left, the house returned to silence once again, but this time the silence felt different. It was no longer filled with questions. It was filled with answers. I gathered the documents carefully, placing them into the folder alongside the statements I had collected the day before, aligning everything in a way that made the progression unmistakable. Then I picked up the phone and called Thomas. He explained everything today, I said, my voice steady, precise. There was a brief pause on the other end, followed by a quiet acknowledgement that carried more weight than any reassurance could. Good, he replied. That means he believes you are no longer a risk. I looked down at the folder in front of me, at the evidence that was no longer scattered but connected, no longer uncertain but clear. That is exactly what he believes, I said. And for the first time since this began, I allowed myself a small, controlled smile. Because belief, I had learned, is the easiest thing to manipulate. And they had just shown me exactly how to do it. The next phase did not require confrontation, it required precision, and precision begins with control over timing, not emotion. So I waited 2 days before making my next move, just enough time for their confidence to settle into routine, just enough time for them to believe everything had returned to normal, because routine makes people careless in ways they do not recognize until it is too late. On the third morning, I called Michael before he had the chance to call me, something I had not done in months, and I made sure my voice carried a softness that suggested reliance rather than awareness. I have been thinking, I said, pausing just long enough to sound uncertain. Maybe we should simplify things even more, just to make sure everything is easier moving forward. There was a brief silence on the line, followed by a shift in his tone that I recognized immediately, a quiet eagerness, restrained but unmistakable. What do you mean, Mom? He asked. I leaned into the moment carefully, shaping my words with intention. Maybe consolidating accounts, reducing the number of places everything is spread across, I said. It feels like too much for me to keep track of. That was the invitation, and he took it exactly the way I knew he would. That actually makes a lot of sense, he replied, his voice gaining energy. It would be much more efficient. Efficient. The word carried more meaning than he realized. Because efficiency, in his mind, meant easier control. And that was exactly what I needed him to believe. We arranged to meet later that afternoon, and when he arrived, Rachel was already with him, her presence no longer subtle but expected, as though she had always been part of every decision. This time, they did not wait for me to guide the conversation. Michael immediately began outlining steps, suggesting changes, explaining how everything could be streamlined, his words flowing with a confidence that bordered on impatience. Rachel added details where necessary, her voice calm, precise, filling in gaps without ever appearing to take the lead. They worked well together, I had to admit that. Too well. But coordination can become predictability, and predictability can be used. I listened carefully, nodding at the right moments, asking just enough questions to encourage them to continue, to expand, to reveal more than they intended. If we move everything into one primary account, Michael explained, pointing to a section on the paper, it will be much easier to manage long term. I let my gaze follow his finger, as though I were trying to understand, though I already knew exactly which account he was referring to. The same one Rachel had focused on before. The same one Thomas had identified as critical. That sounds simpler, I said softly, allowing a note of relief into my voice. I would not have to worry as much. That was all the confirmation they needed. Rachel's posture relaxed slightly, her shoulders lowering in a way that suggested the final piece was falling into place. They believed they were securing control, when in reality, they were concentrating their actions into a single point, a single line of movement that could be tracked, documented, and ultimately exposed. As they continued explaining the process, I reached for a pen and wrote down a few notes, not because I needed them, but because it reinforced the image they had of me, a woman trying to keep up, trying to understand, trying to trust. And trust, when misplaced, is the easiest thing to exploit. But what they did not realize was that I was not writing for understanding. I was writing for record. Every suggestion, every adjustment, every decision they proposed was now part of a timeline, a sequence that would no longer appear as isolated actions, but as a deliberate progression. When the meeting ended, Michael seemed satisfied in a way I had not seen before, not cautious, not measured, but certain. "This will make everything easier for you," he said, standing up, his tone final, confident. Rachel smiled, that same composed expression, but this time there was something else beneath it, something closer to anticipation than restraint. I walked them to the door, thanking them in the same quiet way I always had, my voice steady, my expression calm, giving them no reason to doubt what they believed they had accomplished. When the door closed behind them, I did not move immediately. I stood there for a moment, listening to the fading sound of their footsteps, feeling the stillness settle back into the house. Then I turned and walked back to the table, where the papers were still spread out, where the notes I had written remained exactly where I had left them. I gathered everything slowly, deliberately, placing each document into the folder that had now become something more than just a collection of papers. It was a record of intent, a map of decisions, a pattern that no longer needed interpretation. I picked up the phone and called Thomas once more. "They want to consolidate everything," I said, my voice calm, precise. There was a brief pause, then a quiet response. "That means they are accelerating," he said. I looked down at the folder, at the evidence that was no longer incomplete but converging. "Yes," I replied. And that is exactly what I was hoping for. The following morning, I did not wait for them to call, and I did not wait for anything to unfold naturally. Because there comes a point when patience is no longer about waiting, but about choosing the exact moment to act, and I knew that moment had arrived. I called Thomas early, before the day could carry me into hesitation, and told him I was ready. There was no need for long explanations. He had seen everything he needed to see. "Then we move now," he said, his voice steady, precise. "Before they realize how much they have already revealed." Within hours, everything was set in motion, not loudly, not dramatically, but with the same quiet efficiency they had relied on. Only this time, it was working against them. By midday, I was seated in Thomas's office again, the same chair, the same desk, but a completely different understanding of what was about to happen. The documents were laid out in front of us, not scattered, not uncertain, but organized into a clear sequence that told a story without needing interpretation. Every transfer, every adjustment, every decision Michael had made under the authority I had given him was now visible as part of a pattern that could not be dismissed as coincidence. "We will begin by revoking the power of attorney," Thomas explained, sliding a document toward me. "Effective immediately." I looked at the paper for a moment, not because I was unsure, but because I understood exactly what this meant. Not just legally, but personally. This was the moment where control shifted back, not gradually, not subtly, but completely. I picked up the pen and signed without hesitation. The movement was simple, controlled, final. And just like that, the authority I had once handed over was no longer theirs to use. But that was only the first step. "Now," Thomas continued, "we notify the bank, freeze the affected accounts, and begin documenting the misuse formally." There was no anger in his voice, no judgment, just clarity. The kind of clarity that turns confusion into action. By the time I left his office, the process had already begun. Calls had been made. Notices had been sent. Systems that once allowed access were now closing, quietly but firmly. When I returned home, I did not sit down. I did not reflect. I prepared, because I knew what would happen next. It did not take long. Late that afternoon, my phone rang. Michael's name appeared on the screen, and I let it ring once, twice, 3 times before answering, giving him just enough time to feel the shift before hearing my voice. "Mom," he said, and there was something different now, something strained beneath the surface of his usual confidence. "Did you make changes to the accounts?" I paused for a moment, not out of uncertainty, but to let the silence do its work. "Yes," I said simply. Another pause, longer this time, heavier. "Why?" he asked, and the question carried more than confusion. It carried the beginning of realization. I remained calm, my voice steady, unchanged. "Because I needed to understand what was happening," I replied. There was movement on his end, the faint sound of something shifting, as if he were pacing, trying to find ground that was no longer there. "We talked about this," he said, his tone tightening. "I am handling everything for you." I let that statement settle between us before responding. "No," I said quietly. "You were handling everything for yourself." The line went silent. Not disconnected, not broken, but silent in a way that confirmed everything that needed to be confirmed. When he spoke again, his voice had changed. The certainty was gone.